In the last video, we just looked at how to win a solvency deficit when you are arguing for a policy AF and you are debating a criticism. We looked at the 4 things you have to do in order to win that solvency deficit. In this video, we are going to look at the P in SPOT, the permutation. There are many different things that you can do with the permutation. Some of them are just standard responses that you should make almost every time, just in case it does work. But there is some strategic utility to the permutation. It just might not win you a round very often. And the reason it might not win you the round very often is that criticisms are very good at generating links. They almost always find a link to your affirmative. So going for a permutation is not always the best idea, but there are some times where it becomes strategically viable to use it as a tool in order to beat the criticism. So let's talk about those instances. First, just like against a counterplan, you want to always say permutation do both in order to prevent crazy scenarios. So you want to prevent crazy scenarios. So oftentimes, counterplans, especially advantage counterplans, if there is not a permutation do both, the negative in the block can stand up and read a bunch of add-on scenarios that their counterplan is able to solve for. And then they can use those to leverage against any solvency deficits or any other arguments made on the counterplan. The same logic applies to a criticism. An alternative could be able to solve for a whole host of different problems that might be occurring in the world. For example, maybe someone is reading a securitization AF. They say in the 1 in C that they're able to solve for conflict, but in the 2 in C, because you did not permit, they also are able to solve for the environment. They could then leverage the environment scenario as a reason why it outweighs any war scenarios that you would have read in the 1AC. But a simple permutation will at least be able to suck up any sort of offense they would be able to gain from reading additional scenarios, because you would be doing both of them. Now, you obviously will still have to debate the desirability of those things, but simply by perming, it should prevent add-on scenarios being read inside the block. The second thing that you can do with a permutation is read the double bind argument. The double bind argument simply says the alternative in the criticism is criticizing the status quo so much that either A, the alternative cannot solve because there's just so many different instances of the criticism of securitization, for example, occurring in the world that the alternative just cannot solve. It's not possible for the alternative to be able to solve. So it takes out the uniqueness or the solvency of the alternative, and then you would be able to leverage your affirmative and your case outweighs arguments even better than you would before. It amplifies those sorts of arguments. So in the double bind, either A, the alternative doesn't solve, or B, the perm solves. And the argument here is if there are so many instances of securitization occurring in the world, why does it matter if we securitize inside of this room? Because if the alternative is able to solve for every other instance that is occurring in the world, it should be able to overcome one small instance that is occurring inside of this debate. So it is the classic double bind argument. This isn't going to win you too many rounds, but if conceded, can still be a persuasive argument that judges will vote on. The third thing you can do with a permutation is a little bit more complicated, but it's combined with a method impact term. And it's also a double bind, so I'll call it the method double bind. And the argument here is that if your 1AC utilizes science, and it just has a wreck of science being used inside of the 1AC, and the criticism is in a situation where either the alternative does not use science and therefore you get a link to science good offense arguments, or the alternative can use science, and because your 1AC uses science, they are compatible and can be done together. It's difficult to explain, but if you can explain it and write it out in 25 seconds for the 1AR, it's a difficult argument to be able to respond to for the negative, because your epistemology is not mutually exclusive with the criticisms, and therefore you should be able to permute the two in order to be able to produce both impact, be able to solve for all of the impacts presented in the round. And then the last reason you might want a permutation is with a performative contradiction, or more important, not necessarily a performative contradiction, scratch that, more importantly, a place where they link to themselves. So they link to themselves. Oftentimes, people will read things like a neoliberalism or a capitalism criticism alongside with a disadvantage that claims to solve for the economy. Now, most of the time, most judges aren't like it's a clear double turn, but it does present tension between both the criticism and the disadvantage. You can use that as an opportunity to explain if the 1NC is advocating both of those positions. It should also be true that if those two things can be advocated at the same time, then both the affirmative and the criticism should be able to be advocated at the same time. You can use this argument in combination with some conditionality arguments to be able to justify this argument, and it might be able to get you some credibility to be able to solve. If nothing else, it is an argument that is difficult for the negative to be able to respond to, and unless they are extremely good, they're going to have to spend a lot of time answering it. So we've just looked at 4 different utilities of a permutation when debating a criticism. So although a permutation might not be the best way to go about beating a criticism when you are a policy aff, it can present some strategic possibilities. You can prevent crazy add-on scenarios that the alternative might be able to solve for. You can put them in a double bind with the permutation. You can make a method double bind. And you can also use the permutation when they link to themselves to possibly at least mitigate the possibility of their impacts. So now that we've looked at the S and the P part of SPOT, in the next video we're going to look at the O part of SPOT, which is the offense.